Prime Minister Narendra Modi held the bilateral talks with UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Hiroshima on Sunday, where the two leaders reviewed their strategic partnership, including taking stock of progress in India-UK FTA negotiations. The Prime Minister, along with other G7 leaders, also paid floral tribute at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park in Japan. Prime Minister Modi is set to attend a session at the G7 summit on a peaceful, stable and prosperous world, and that's likely to take place later today, following which he will then be proceeding further. The leaders of the Quad group, Australia, India, Japan and the United States, delivered a thinly veiled swipe at Beijing's behaviour on Saturday at a summit in Hiroshima. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, and his three partners in the group did not mention China by name, but the communist superpower was clearly the target of language in a joint statement calling for peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific maritime domain. The Quad leaders held their meeting, which already had gathered in Hiroshima for a Group of 7 summit. Now, joining us is Voice of America's White House Bureau Chief, Patsy Widakuswara. Thank you so much for joining us. Widakuswara, if you could take us through, the G7 leaders' communique, what do you read into it?
So essentially, we can see from the communique that they released here in Hiroshima yesterday that the G7 leaders are really amping up pressure on China and Russia, exactly the two major powers who are not present in this gathering of world leaders, not only of the 7 most industrious democracies in the world, but also G7 supporters, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi, leaders of Indonesia, Brazil, South Korea, and other leaders from the global south. So these two issues, number one, Chinese economic coercion and rising military threat, rising economic security threat, as well as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is really honed into by G7 leaders as the two main threats that the world is facing. And this is really creating a lot of problems for the so-called global south. So essentially, this is an effort by the group's summit host, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida of Japan, who realizes that the world is really suffering right now, not just from the pandemic, not just from the financial instability caused by the war in Ukraine that's creating a rise of prices in food and energy, but also from, all sorts of issues, including unsustainable debt level from what they call Chinese economic coercion practices. These are infrastructure loans from Belt and Road Initiative projects and so on. So all these issues, the leaders are trying to put together, look into, and kind of push back against these issues and help the world try to solve them. Now, of course, China and Russia look at this in a completely different angle. China has come out with a statement pushing back, saying that this is unacceptable. They respond that, the so-called economic coercion, if G7 wants to talk about that, then they should look at the coercion that the United States placed on other members of the G7. And Russia, of course, continues with its war on Ukraine. So those are the major issues, the major themes that's running here in Hiroshima, focused by the G7 leaders on the communique on those two countries, creating what they call a lot of problems in the world right now.
Right, especially in the context of the G20 summit that's coming up later this year.
Yeah, so as we know, Prime Minister Modi will be the summit host in just a couple of months. And this is part of the reason why he is here, because G7 summit host Japan really wants to link up that agenda, right? The agenda that's being discussed by the G7 right now and G7 supporters to be translated, to be moved forward to the G20 summit in New Delhi in a couple of months. And, some observers have noticed that this gathering of the group of G7 plus invitees of leaders from the so-called global south is really like creating a mini G20 minus China and Russia. So this is what, the US and its Western allies and Japan are trying to shore up, trying to bring forward in the G20 agenda, making sure that, all these issues, pushing back against Chinese economic coercion, pushing back against Russian invasion on Ukraine, is carried forward to the G20 summit in India. Now, of course, once the summit happens in New Delhi on the G20, Russia and China, who are both members of the G20, will have their own agenda and have their own say. So all these dynamics is something that summit host Prime Minister Modi will have to think about going forward.
Right. So how successful has Japan's outreach to developing world and the global south, and what is India's role in this outreach?
So I think it's a really big realization, not just by Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who realized, the problem that I have described earlier. The global south is really suffering from, number one, unsustainable debt levels caused by infrastructure loans by China, suffering from post-pandemic economic recovery that may be sluggish, suffering from rising food and energy prices and supply chain issues due to the war in Ukraine. And these are all issues that they want to focus on, not necessarily just bringing countries together to, condemn Russia's invasion or enact sanctions on them or talk tough language on China regarding Taiwan and the South China Sea, but really looking at it at a more concrete level. What is the impact to the global south and what can we do about it? So that is the goal by Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and India's role is essentially to continue that message, right? Because as you know, Prime Minister Modi has been reluctant to be very tough on his language in condemning Russia's invasion. So, this is a kind of like a diplomatic navigation of geopolitical issues by Prime Minister Modi in order to address the real problems without having to, so-called taking sides between the war of the West and China and the West and Russia.
Right, Patsy, if you could just take us to the Quad meet, what's the big takeaway for you?
Well, the big takeaway right now from the Quad meeting is the fact that it has to be so truncated, right? I mean, they were going to meet in a few days in Sydney, the leaders of the US, Japan, Australia, and India. But of course, because President Joe Biden is dealing with a lot of problems back home regarding to negotiations to raise the debt limit, which could create a default by the U.S. for the first time in history if it doesn't happen. What happened was Joe Biden asked Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to essentially bring the Quad summit to Hiroshima, sneaking it in a half-hour session yesterday where the Quad leaders sat together. And, that's the big issue, is the question of whether or not the United States can deal with its domestic problems well enough so that it maintains credibility in leading the rest of the world to, a more stable economic security and financial stability. That was the big question. Of course, the White House would say that leaders understand that this is a democracy and we have to deal with problems back home. But aside from all of that, the issues that are facing the Quad, facing so-called Chinese economic coercion, dealing with issues like maritime security, digital connectivity, supply chain issues, those are the kinds of things that the leaders tried to kind of like jam-pack together in the half-hour session that they had yesterday here in Hiroshima.